The morning the notice came, Cordelia Whitmore was making oatmeal. Not because she was hungry. She had not been truly hungry since the July afternoon they carried Harlan out of the Silver Ridge mine on a wooden board, his face covered with someone else's canvas jacket. She made oatmeal every morning because Harlan had liked it, because the act of stirring the pot gave her hands something to do and her mind somewhere small and safe to hide. The knock came at 7. She knew before she opened the door. You live long enough in a mining camp, you learn to read knocks. The company knock had a particular quality to it, measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of a decision made far away by men who had never stood in this valley. Emmett Cole stood on the porch, 26 years old, maybe 27, clean-shaved, holding his hat in both hands the way young men do when they are about to say something they wish someone else had been sent to say. Cordelia looked at him for a long moment without speaking. She had seen his type before. Not cruel, not indifferent, just young enough to still believe that following orders and causing harm were two separate things. He held out the envelope. She took it, thanked him with a nod, went back to her oatmeal. Emmett Cole stood in the doorway, uncertain whether he had been dismissed. She read the letter standing at the stove, one hand still holding the wooden spoon. The company's language was careful and bloodless, the way legal language always is when it is doing something that plain language would make too ugly to say aloud. The Silver Ridge Mining Company regretted. The company recognized the contribution of the late Harlan Whitmore. The company was prepared to offer a settlement of $68 in recognition of 7 years of service and the circumstances of his passing. The house was needed by November 1st. Cordelia set the letter on the table. She picked up her spoon. She stirred the oatmeal. Behind her, Emmett Cole cleared his throat. She turned then and looked at him fully for the first time. There was something in his face beyond discomfort, something that looked almost like shame. She said, "How old are you, Mr. Cole?" 26, ma'am. Were you born here in Colorado? No, ma'am, Kansas. Did you know my husband? A pause. Something shifted in the young man's eyes. I knew who he was. Everyone knew Mr. Whitmore. Cordelia nodded slowly. Then you know he spent 7 years underground for this company. You know he went into that tunnel on a Tuesday morning the same way he went in every morning, trusting that the timbers were sound. She paused. They were not sound, Mr. Cole. The company knew they were not sound. And my husband is in the ground now because of it. Emmett Cole said nothing. His hands tightened around the brim of his hat. $68, Cordelia said. That is what the company believes a man's life is worth. 7 years, 2,200 days underground, and $68. Mrs. Whitmore, I am 64 years old, she said, her voice level and clear. I have no children. My sister died of fever in Ohio 11 years ago. Harlan's brother has not spoken to us since 1871. I have no people left in this world, Mr. Cole. Do you understand what I am telling you? I am not being dramatic. I am giving you facts. 64 years old, alone in October in the Colorado mountains. And the company wants this house by November 1st. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room like water. Emmett Cole looked at his hat. Then he looked up. His jaw worked once as if he was about to say something that had not been approved by anyone above him. I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore, he said finally. Truly. It was not enough. It could never be enough. But Cordelia heard something genuine in it, and she was old enough to know that genuine was rarer than it should be. Thank you for delivering the notice, she said. You may go. She spent 3 days inside the house after that, not paralyzed, not weeping, not yet. She moved through the rooms with the careful, methodical energy of a woman who has trained herself over 64 years to do the next necessary thing regardless of how she feels about it. She cataloged. She sorted. She made lists on the back of paper she saved from flour sacks because paper costs money, and habits of economy do not dissolve just because the world has dissolved around them. What she had, $68 in company settlement. $11 she had saved from taking in mending and cooking extra for the bachelor miners over the past 2 years. Furniture that would not survive a wagon journey and was worth almost nothing anyway. Harlan's tools, some kitchen equipment, his collection of books, 7 volumes, each one read so many times the spines had cracked and been re-glued with flour paste. Her own clothes, practical and worn. A winter coat that had been repaired so many times it was more repair than original coat. What she faced Denver was 3 days by wagon and represented a kind of slow death she refused to accept. The boarding houses there hired young women. She had watched what happened to older widows who arrived in cities without money or connections. The charitable institutions of Denver in 1883 were not places of dignity. They were places where you waited and diminished and finally disappeared. She could try to find work in the settlement, but the settlement was a company town. The company owned the houses, the store credit system, the goodwill. A woman the company had just evicted would find doors closing before she reached them. She could write to distant relatives. But letters took weeks and replies were never guaranteed, and winter in the Rocky Mountains at 9,000 feet did not wait for correspondence. She sat at the kitchen table on the third evening and looked at Harlan's books stacked in the corner. 7 volumes. She had read all of them too. They had read aloud to each other on winter nights for 7 years. Harlan's voice slow and deliberate, his finger tracing lines when words were difficult, never ashamed of the gaps in his formal education, because he believed reading itself was the education. She pulled the stack toward her and went through them one by one. The 4th book from the bottom was not a book at all. It was a journal. Brown leather, the cover worn soft from handling. She had seen it before, had seen Harlan writing in it on Sunday evenings, but had never read it because a person's private journal is their own country, and Cordelia had always respected borders. Harlan had been dead for 3 months. She opened it. His handwriting was large and slightly uneven, the handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write past the age when such things come easily. The early entries were practical notes about rock formations, mineral signs, the kind of observations a man makes when he is always looking at the ground professionally and cannot stop looking even when he is free. Then deeper in the entries changed. He wrote about the mountains the way some men write about cathedrals. He described hidden meadows he had found on his days-off viewpoints, where the whole range spread out like a painted backdrop, unusual features of the landscape that he tucked away in his memory, like a man slowly furnishing a house he planned to live in someday. And then dated September 14th, 1879, 4 years before his death, found something today worth remembering. South-facing slope on the ridge above Garnet Creek, about 2 miles northeast of the camp. Rock collapsed long ago granite and left a chamber behind. Went in to look. Approximately 30 feet deep, 15 feet wide at the center. Ceiling height around 9 feet in the middle. Completely dry, despite the creek below. There is a natural crack in the ceiling that draws air. I held a match near it, and the flame bent. The entrance faces almost due south. In winter with the sun low, this opening would receive direct light most of the day. Good emergency shelter, south-facing, always dry, the kind of place you would want to know about if things ever went wrong. I should take Cora there someday. Cordelia read that last line 4 times. She closed the journal. She sat in the silence of the house for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the pines the way it always did at this elevation. Not a gentle wind, but a serious one. A wind that meant what it said. I should take Cora there someday. He never had. Something happened inside her chest. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something older and harder and more useful than grief. The feeling a person gets when they realize that the thing they needed was waiting for them all along, and the only question now is whether they are willing to go and get it. She put the journal in her coat pocket. She went to bed. She slept for the first time in 3 days. In the morning, she went to find the cave. The walk took 90 minutes. The trail to Garnet Creek was familiar. Harlan had taken her that direction before, though never as far as the ridge above. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of October morning in Colorado that looks deceptively gentle until the wind reminds you what month it is. Cordelia walked steadily. She was not a fast walker. She had not been fast at anything for 15 years. But she was consistent. Harlan had always said that about her. You're not quick, Cora, but you're relentless. He had meant it as the highest compliment. She had taken it as one. She found the ridge. She found the slope. She spent 40 minutes searching before she found the entrance partially hidden by fallen timber and brush that had accumulated over years. A dark opening in the gray granite face maybe 5 feet high and 6 feet wide. She stood at the entrance for a moment. The morning light fell across the rock at an angle that made the granite glow faintly amber. From somewhere inside came a slight movement of air, barely perceptible, a slow exhalation as if the mountain itself was breathing. Cordelia lit the torch she had prepared, pine pitch and cloth wrapped around a dry stick, and crawled through the entrance. She stood up inside. The first thing she registered was the scale. The journal entry had been accurate in dimensions, but had not captured what 30 feet of depth and 9 feet of ceiling height actually felt like. The chamber was large, genuinely large. Not a hiding place, but a room. A room with walls of solid granite, a floor that was mostly level, and a ceiling that arched upward in a way that felt deliberate, as if the mountain had decided on its own to create interior space. She moved the torch slowly. The walls showed no moisture. The floor had decades of accumulated dust and small debris, but no evidence of water intrusion. She walked to the back of the chamber and looked up at the ceiling. There, a narrow crack, maybe 4 inches wide, extending upward into darkness. She held her torch near it. The flame bent. Natural ventilation. A chimney that the mountain had built for itself before any person thought to look for it. Cordelia turned slowly in the middle of the chamber, taking inventory the way she had taken inventory of her house 3 days ago. But this inventory was different. This one was full of possibility rather than stripped of it. The entrance faced south. The letters were small and carefully cut, the work of a man who had brought a chisel with him on a Sunday walk because he wanted to mark a place that mattered. H.W. 1879. Harlan William Whitmore. 1879. 4 years before he died. 7 years before she would have thought to ask him where he had gone on all those solitary walks. Below the letters he had left a space. A deliberate space the right size for 2 more initials and a year. CW underscore, underscore, underscore. He had intended this. Maybe not consciously, maybe not as a plan. Harlan had not been a man who made elaborate plans. But somewhere in the part of a long marriage that lives below language, he had known. He had found this place and marked it and left room for her name because some part of him understood that she would need it someday. Cordelia pressed her palm flat against the granite beside his initials. The rock was cold. It had been cold for 10,000 years, and it would be cold for 10,000 more. But beneath her hand she felt something, the faint stored warmth of the afternoon sun that had fallen on this southern slope for every day of September and October, and was still there, still releasing hours after sunset. The mountain was warm inside. Whatever was happening on the surface, however cold it got, whatever wind drove snow against the entrance, inside the mountain held its temperature. Harlan had known that. He had written it down. Always dry. She allowed herself 30 seconds of something that was not quite grief and not quite comfort, but lived somewhere in the narrow country between them. She let herself feel the full weight of what it meant that he was gone, that he would never stand here with her, that the entry in the journal had been written by a living man who had no idea it would become a kind of message. 30 seconds. Then she straightened. She took the chisel she had brought from Harlan's toolbox. She had not known why she brought it when she packed her bag this morning, but the body sometimes knows before the mind does. And she cut 2 letters into the granite beside his. CW. She left the year blank. She would fill in the year when she had earned it, when she had survived. She walked back to the settlement in the late afternoon, the journal in her pocket and the chisel in her bag. The light was failing fast, the way it does at altitude in October, not a gradual dimming, but a sudden withdrawal, as if the sun had decided it was done. She had 11 days before November 1st. 11 days to do what needed to be done. Cordelia Whitmore had spent 64 years learning that the difference between people who survive impossible things and people who do not is rarely strength or youth or luck. It is almost always the willingness to look at what is real without flinching, and then to take the next necessary step without waiting to feel ready. She was not ready. She was 64 years old with a bongan waiting to happen and a winter coming that had killed unprepared men half her age. But she knew where the cave was. She knew what needed to be built. And she knew, in the way that a person knows something they have carried so long, it has become part of their skeleton, that Harlan had found that cave and left her name on the wall because he had always understood her better than she understood herself. He had known she would not go to Denver. He had known she would not go quietly into any of the soft-edged, dignified diminishments that the world offers to old women when it wants them to stop taking up space. He had found her a place in the mountain and marked it with her initials and trusted to her to find it. She intended to be worthy of that trust. She stopped once on the walk back and looked up at the ridge where the cave waited in the darkness, invisible from here, unknown to anyone in the settlement, below a room in the granite that the mountain had been keeping ready for 400 million years without knowing what it was for. Now it knew. The wind came down off the ridge and hit her full in the face, carrying ice and intention. She leaned into it and kept walking. George Patton had owned the general store at Silver Ridge for 21 years, and in that time he had seen most of what a mining settlement could produce in the way of human circumstance. He had seen men come in the morning to buy rope and known by the look in their eyes that the rope was not for fencing. He had extended credit to families in the weeks after accidents and written off the debt quietly when the family left. He set down the crate he was unpacking and looked at Cordelia across the counter. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "George," she said, "I need supplies. I have a list." He looked at the list she placed on the counter, read it once, read it again more slowly. Then he looked up. "What exactly are you building? A dwelling?" "Where, on the ridge, there is a natural cave formation above Garnet Creek. I intend to close the entrance with a stone wall and make it habitable." George Patton was quiet for a moment. He was a man who thought before he spoke, which Cordelia had always respected. "Cora," he said the first time he had used her given name, which told her something about how seriously he was taking this. "You are 64 years old. Building a dry stone wall is going to destroy your hands." "Then they will be destroyed," she said. "Write up the total, George." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he reached under the counter for his order book. He went through the list with her item by item. A good shovel, $3.50. A pickaxe, $3. A handsaw, $2. A hammer, $1. 2 boxes of nails, 60 cents. A small cast iron wood stove with 18 inches of stovepipe, $8.25. 10 pounds of lime mortar mix, $1.50. A large canvas tarp, $3. A lantern with 2 bottles of oil, $1.75. A good skinning knife, 80 cents. Food supplies, 50 pounds of flour, $3. 20 pounds of dried beans, $1.40. 10 pounds of salt, pork, $2. Salt, sugar, ground coffee, and lard together came to $3.10. Matches, a bar of lye soap, and a small tin of petroleum jelly for the cold $1.90. George added the column twice. $41.30. Cordelia counted out the money from the envelope in her coat pocket, the envelope that had arrived with the eviction notice. She set $42 on the counter without comment. George made change. Then he paused. He went to the back of the store and came back with items he set on the counter beside her purchases without adding to the bill. A thick coil of rope, a bundle of cotton cloth cut into strips for bandaging, a small tin of camphor salve, 3 extra candles beyond the ones she had ordered, a pair of heavy leather work gloves, the kind with double-stitched palms, and a small notebook, plain brown cover with a short pencil tucked inside the spiral binding. "Write down what you build," he said. "The techniques, the quantities, what works and what doesn't." He paused. "Someone should know how you did it." Cordelia looked at the notebook for a moment. Then she put it with the rest of the supplies. "I'll need help loading the handcart," she said. "I'll load it myself." And she made 3 trips up the mountain over 2 days, hauling the handcart each time up the trail to Garnet Creek, and then abandoning the cart where the trail became too rough and carrying loads by hand up the final slope to the cave entrance. The stove was the worst of it, 40 pounds of cast iron that had to be broken down into its components and wrapped in the canvas tarp and dragged up a granite scree field, one component at a time. By the end of the second day, everything was staged at the cave entrance. Cordelia sat on a flat rock outside the opening and looked at her supplies and made herself eat a cold meal of salt pork and hardtack before she began. She had learned long ago that the body is not a servant, it is a partner, and partners require negotiation. Then she went inside and began. The first task was clearing. 2 full days of removing what decades of weather and wind and animal activity had deposited on the cave floor. Dust and small rocks and organic debris, pine needles, bark fragments, the dry remains of small animals that had used the cave for shelter over the years. She swept with a branch first, then shoveled carrying loads out to scatter down the hillside. As she cleared, the cave revealed itself more fully. The floor sloped gently from the back wall toward the entrance, which was exactly what she needed. Water, if any ever intruded, would drain naturally outward. The granite walls were solid throughout, no active cracking, no loose sections. The ceiling crack that drew air was positioned almost exactly over the midpoint of the chamber, which meant a stove placed beneath it would exhaust efficiently. On the second day of clearing, she discovered something the journal had not mentioned. Along the western wall, a section of granite had weathered in a way that left natural horizontal ledges in the rock, not deep only 4 or 5 inches, but level and solid. Ready-made shelves built by 10,000 years of freeze and thaw. Harlan had not noticed them, or perhaps he had noticed and simply not written it down. She ran her hand along the longest ledge, level, dry, solid as the mountain itself. She allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. Then she picked up the shovel and went back to work. The foundation work came next. The cave floor, while mostly level, had irregularities, high points, and low points in the granite base that would make building and living difficult. Cordelia spent 3 days gathering medium-sized stones from the surrounding slope, pieces roughly the size of bread loaves, and using them to fill low areas and create level platforms along both sides of the cave interior. She worked methodically. She did not rush. Rushing with stonework she had learned from watching construction crews in the Ohio town where she had grown up was how people got hurt and how walls fell down. The center of the cave she left lower than the sides, creating a shallow channel from back to entrance that would guide any water out rather than letting it pool beneath where she would sleep and sit and cook. On the 4th day, she began the entrance wall. This was the work she had been thinking about since she first stood inside the cave and understood what needed to be done. The entrance wall was the critical piece. Everything else, the stove, the storage, the sleeping platform, depended on having a weatherproof barrier between the interior and the Colorado winter. She had seen dry stone walls built in the hills above the Ohio Valley as a child, old walls that had stood for 50 or 60 years without mortar, holding their shape through the logic of weight and interlocking geometry, rather than through any adhesive. She had watched the men who built them with the particular attention of a child who finds competence beautiful. She understood the principles. A dry stone wall is not stacked. It is fitted. Each stone is a 3-dimensional puzzle piece that must be selected, oriented, and positioned so that its weight presses down and inward rather than outward. The joints between stones in one course must be bridged by stones in the course above. Vertical alignment of joints creates fault lines. Horizontal bridging creates strength. The wall should lean slightly inward, perhaps 5 degrees from vertical, so that gravity pulls the structure toward its own center rather than away from it. The first course took 2 full days. She selected the largest, flattest stones she could move by herself, pieces weighing between 20 and 40 pounds, and placed them in a line across the full width of the entrance. Each stone was tested before it was set. She stood on each one, shifted her weight to every corner, applied lateral pressure with her boot. She sat down on the cave floor and held her wrist against her chest and breathed. She did not cry. She assessed. The wrist was not broken. She could feel that much broken bones in the wrist produce a specific quality of pain she had experienced once before at 41 when she had fallen on ice. This was different. This was the deep spreading ache of soft tissue damage. Bad. Possibly very bad, but not bone. She unwrapped a length of the cotton bandaging George had packed for her and wrapped the wrist firmly the way she had wrapped similar injuries on others over the years. She tied it tight enough for support, but not so tight as to restrict blood flow. Then she looked at the wall. 12 feet of the base course were set. She needed the wall to reach 6 feet high across the full 6-foot width of the entrance. She needed the door frame built into it, the ventilation opening near the top, the lintel stone positioned over the doorway. She needed perhaps 5 more days of full work to complete it. She had 8 days left before November 1st. She looked at her bandaged right hand. Then she looked at her left. She picked up the next stone with her left hand, leading, and her right hand used only for guidance and light support. It was slower. It was awkward. The left side of her body was not as coordinated as the right for this kind of work, and would not become so in the time she had. But it would do. It would have to do. The days that followed were the hardest of her life, and Cordelia Whitmore had lived a life that had not been gentle with her. She worked from first light until the light failed. She ate cold food at noon. She did not light a fire during the day because the stove was not yet installed, and she could not afford to fill the cave with smoke. She drank water from the creek below, carrying it up in the canteen she had bought from George. At night, when the temperature dropped and the darkness inside the cave became total, She wrapped herself in the canvas tarp and the blankets she had brought and slept on the raised stone platform she had built in the corner, exhausted past the point where cold or discomfort could keep her awake. Each morning she unwrapped her right wrist. Each morning it was a little better than the morning before, and each morning she wrapped it again and gave it a little more use, working back toward full capacity, the way you work a rusted hinge slowly with consistent pressure, never forcing. The wall grew, course by course, stone by stone. Each piece selected from the pile she had accumulated outside the entrance, carried in fitted, tested, adjusted set. The joints in each course were bridged by the course above. The wall leaned inward at its gentle 5-degree angle. The exterior and interior faces were as flat and regular as she could make them with irregular, natural stone. On the 6th day of wall construction, she reached the height where the doorway lintel needed to be placed. She had identified the lintel stone 4 days earlier and had been moving it incrementally closer to its final position ever since. It was a piece of granite approximately 4 feet long, 8 inches wide, and 4 inches thick, relatively thin for its length, which was why she had chosen it. Thick enough to bear load. Thin enough that its total weight, perhaps 75 pounds, was within the range of what she could manage with leverage. She built temporary support columns on both sides of the doorway, opening from stacked stone, not mortared, just stable enough to hold for an hour. She raised each column in stages, moving the lintel stone up a few inches at a time, using a thick branch as a lever, resting the stone on the new level of support building, the columns higher repeating. It took 4 hours. When the lintel stone finally rested in its correct position spanning the doorway, Cordelia stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then she carefully disassembled the temporary supports stone by stone, watching the lintel for any sign of movement. It did not move. The weight of the wall courses pressing down on both ends held it as securely as any mortar could have. More securely, perhaps, the mechanical force of stone on stone does not crack or shrink or fail the way bonded joints can fail. She built the courses above the lintel with particular care, ensuring that each stone directed its weight toward the lintel's ends rather than toward its unsupported center. The arch effect weight traveling around an opening rather than straight through it was a principle that engineers understood mathematically and that stonemasons understood intuitively from the evidence of their hands. Cordelia understood it the second way. It was on the 7th day of wall construction, her 13th day living and working on the ridge, that she heard boots on the loose rock of the slope below. She was on the exterior face of the wall using a flat stick to work lime mortar into the joints between stones. The wall was nearly 5 feet high at this point, substantial enough that she could not see over it from outside without standing on something. She heard the footsteps stop, then silence. She came around the edge of the wall and found Emmett Cole standing 12 feet away, looking at what she had built. He was in his company coat, the gray one with the Silver Ridge Mining Company emblem on the breast pocket. He had clearly been walking the ridge on some kind of survey or errand and had come across the cave entrance, or rather had come across the wall, which was no longer something you could mistake for natural rock formation. 5 feet of carefully laid dry stone across a granite opening announced itself as human intention without apology. He looked at the wall for a long time. Then he looked at Cordelia. She held the flat stick in her left hand. Her right wrist was bandaged, visible at the end of her sleeve. She was covered in granite dust from the waist down. Her face had the particular expression of a woman who is not asking permission for anything. Emmett Cole was 26 years old. He worked for the Silver Ridge Mining Company. He had the authority and arguably the professional obligation to report this to his supervisors, a widow living on company-adjacent land building, unauthorized structures, preparing to winter alone on a ridge above the settlement. There were forms for this. There were procedures. He looked at her bandaged wrist. He looked at the wall, at the careful courses, the bridged joints, the slight inward lean, the lintel stone seated with its precise mechanical logic. He looked back at Cordelia. Something moved through his face. Not one thing, but several things in quick succession, the way weather moves through a valley, and then it settled into something that was not quite resolution, but was close enough to function as one. He turned and walked back down the slope the way he had come. He did not look back. He did not report anything. Cordelia watched him go until he was out of sight. Then she went back to the mortar work. The wall was complete on November 12th. She stood outside in the cold morning air and looked at what she had made. Approximately 6 feet high across most of its width, rising to nearly 7 feet at the center. 18 inches thick at the base, tapering to 12 at the top. The exterior face mortared with lime, the joints sealed against wind and driving snow. The doorway centered in the wall with its granite lintel, seated clean and straight. A small ventilation opening near the upper right corner, positioned to align with the natural chimney crack inside. 700 stones roughly. She had not counted, but she had lost count somewhere past 500 and estimated the rest. Several tons of granite, every piece selected and carried and placed by a 64-year-old woman with a damaged right wrist, working mostly alone on a ridge in the Colorado mountains in October and November. She ran her hand along the exterior face. The mortar was fully cured, now hard and pale gray, filling the joints cleanly. The surface was rough but coherent, the way all real things are rough, not the smoothness of something manufactured, but the particular texture of something built by a person who understood what they were doing. The door she had built from split timber and hung on iron hinges filled the doorway opening with reasonable precision. The fit was not perfect. There were gaps at the top corners that she had sealed with strips of canvas soaked in pine pitch, which would hold until spring. She had installed the wood stove in the main living area, positioned directly beneath the ceiling crack, the stovepipe running up into the fissure, and sealed around its base with clay dug from the creek bank. She had tested the draw before sealing. The smoke rose cleanly, pulled upward by the natural convection of the chimney crack, disappearing into the mountain without hesitation. She had built a sleeping platform from flat stones in the northeast corner, raised 18 inches from the floor, insulated underneath with pine needles packed between the stones. She had sewn canvas into a large bag and filled it with dried grass and pine needles for a mattress. It was not comfortable by any standard she had known in her previous life. It was better than the ground, and the ground was not going to kill her, so the platform was more than sufficient. The interior wall, a 3-foot-high divider of dry stacked stone, running lengthwise across the cave, separated the living area from the storage section. In the storage section, filling every available vertical foot from floor to near the ceiling, was firewood. 3 cords, possibly a little more. All of it cut to length. All of it split where splitting improved burning. All of it stacked in organized rows with gaps between pieces for air circulation. All of it inside the cave behind the stone wall, protected from weather by the mountain itself. Every piece was dry. Every piece would stay dry, regardless of what happened outside. Cordelia stood in the storage section and ran her hand along the nearest stack of split pine. The wood was light-colored inside the split, pale and clean, the resin scent still present. Wood that had been dead long enough to be fully seasoned, but had never been rained on because it had been standing timber, sheltered by its own bark until she cut it. She thought about the families down in the settlement. She had seen their wood piles stacked against the sides of houses covered with canvas tarps that the wind worked loose by November, exposed to snow that would soak in and freeze and turn good fuel into something that hissed and smoked and produced a fraction of the heat it should. She had watched this pattern for 7 winters. She knew what happened to those wood piles by February. She knew what would not happen to hers. 16 days after she had started on the evening of November 12th, Cordelia Whitmore sat inside her stone cabin inside the mountain and lit her first fire. The kindling caught immediately. The larger pieces followed. The draw from the ceiling crack pulled the smoke cleanly upward. The cast iron stove began to tick as it expanded with heat, the small metallic sounds of a cold thing warming up, familiar and domestic in a way that filled the chamber with something that was almost a kind of normalcy. The temperature inside had been 44 degrees when she lit the fire. She measured it by feel, having spent enough winters in cold places to know the difference between 40 and 50 and 60 with a reliability that any thermometer would have confirmed. Within an hour, it was 55 degrees. The granite walls held the warmth the way they had always held, cold, slowly, thoroughly, with the permanence of stone. The thermal mass of the surrounding mountain was not a theory. It was physics. It was 10,000 tons of rock that had been absorbing and releasing energy for longer than any human institution had existed. Cordelia had simply borrowed from it. She sat on her sleeping platform and ate a meal of beans cooked on the stovetop and felt the warmth on her face and listened to the wind building outside. It was going to be a hard winter. Everyone in the settlement had said so. The old-timers who had been here through the worst years said the signs were clear. Early snow, the particular quality of the October cold, the way the elk had moved down from the high country 2 weeks earlier than usual. Hard winter. Cordelia looked at her wood supply stacked dry and accessible 12 feet away behind the interior divider wall. She looked at the flame visible through the stove's small front grate. She looked at the granite ceiling above her 9 feet of natural arch that had stood for longer than the concept of architecture. She opened the small brown notebook George had given her and found the pencil inside the binding and wrote the date at the top of the first page, November 12th, 1883. Below that, she began to write. Not about feelings, not about Harlan or the eviction notice or what she had lost. She wrote what George had asked for: the techniques, the quantities, the things that had worked and the things that had not. The order of operations that she had discovered through error and correction, and the specific logic of building with natural stone. She wrote for an hour, filling 4 pages in her careful, even handwriting. Then she closed the notebook and banked the fire for the night and lay down on the pine needle mattress inside the stone cabin inside the mountain and listened to the wind work itself into a full storm outside, and found to her genuine surprise that she was not afraid. The mountain held her. The wall she had built held the mountain at bay, and the firewood behind the interior wall was dry and stacked and waiting as many cords of it as she would need for as many months as the winter intended to last. She closed her eyes. Outside, the first serious snow of 1883 began to fall. The first serious storm arrived on November 28th and stayed for 3 days. Cordelia knew it was coming before it came. She had lived at 9,000 feet long enough to read the particular quality of stillness that precedes a major storm, the way sound travels differently, the way the pines stop moving even before the wind dies, the way the air takes on a metallic weight that settles in the back of the throat. She spent the afternoon before the storm sealing the gap under the door with a rolled strip of canvas, soaked in pine pitch, and moving an extra quarter cord of wood from the storage section into the living area so she would not need to open the interior divider door more than necessary once the cold came in hard. She was ready before the first flake fell. When the storm hit, it hit with the full intention of a Colorado winter that has been holding back since September and has decided it is done being patient. 2 feet of snow in the first 24 hours, then another 8 inches. Wind that drove the snow horizontally across the ridge, finding every gap and depression in the landscape and filling them with a white that had no interest in being beautiful. The temperature outside dropped to 15 below zero, then to 20 below. On the second night of the storm, Cordelia pressed her palm flat against the interior face of her stone wall and felt the cold radiating through it from outside, genuine, serious cold, the kind that kills, and felt the warmth of the living space pressing back against her from behind. The wall held. The cave held 42 degrees without any fire. With the small stove burning at a moderate rate, the interior settled at 55, sometimes 58. Not warm the way a well-furnished house is warm, warm the way competence is warm, solid and sufficient in exactly what was needed. She burned 4 pounds of wood that first day. Perhaps 5 the second when the storm was at its worst and the temperature outside dropped further, and she allowed herself the small extravagance of a slightly larger fire in the evening. The wood caught immediately every time. No coaxing, no damp hissing, no half-combustion that produced smoke and creosote and a fraction of the heat the wood was capable of giving. Every piece she took from the stack was fully seasoned and fully dry, and it burned the way dry wood burns, clean and hot, and completely leaving white ash rather than the dark, wet residue of compromised fuel. On the third morning the storm broke. Cordelia opened her door to a landscape that had been remade overnight. Snow everywhere drifted into shapes that followed no logic, but the winds piled against the rock faces in formations that would have been beautiful if beauty had been something she had time to consider. The entrance area of the cave had accumulated perhaps 18 inches of drift, easy enough to shovel out with the work she had already done to create drainage away from the door. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking out at the transformed ridge. Her wood supply behind the interior wall was exactly as she had left it, dry, accessible, untouched by weather. While the storm had done whatever it wished to everything outside, the inside of the mountain had simply continued being the inside of the mountain. She went back in, rebuilt the fire from banked coals, and made coffee. December settled over the settlement below, and the ridge above with the methodical severity of a Colorado winter. That means to be taken seriously. Cordelia moved into the routines that would define the next 4 months of her life. She woke each morning when the light began at the entrance, gray and gradual in December, a slow brightening that came through the small gap she deliberately left unblocked at the top of the doorframe for ventilation and light. She rebuilt the fire from coals she kept alive through the night with a careful banking technique, covering the embers with ash to slow combustion, leaving just enough oxygen that the heat persisted until morning. She melted snow for water in a pot on the stovetop. She cooked simple meals, cornmeal mush, in the mornings, beans with salt pork at midday. When she was working hard, sometimes just coffee and hardtack in the evenings, when the cold had reduced her appetite to a formality. She wrote in the notebook George had given her every evening by lantern light. The early entries were technical stove output at various wood loads, temperature differentials between the living area and the entrance wall, observations about which wood species burned hottest and which produced the cleanest exhaust. She noted that pine burned fast and hot, good for quick warming. She noted that the dead aspen she had cut from the grove below the ridge burned slower and held coals longer, better for overnight banking. She noted the exact daily consumption, rarely more than 5 pounds of wood, sometimes as little as 3 on the mildest days. Later entries became something else. Less inventory, more observation. Notes about the quality of light at different hours as the winter sun traced its low arc across the southern sky and sent its angled rays directly into the cave entrance, warming the front section of the floor to a temperature she could feel through the soles of her boots. Notes about the granite walls, how they were cold to the touch in the morning and measurably warmer by evening after a full day of fire, how the warmth lingered for hours after the fire had been banked, how the mass of the mountain was doing work that no amount of wood could have done alone. She read Harlan's books in the evenings, working through the 7 volumes, slowly rationing the pleasure of them the way she rationed the coffee. She ventured outside when weather permitted, which was not every day, but was more often than the settlement below would have believed possible. She gathered additional wood on the clearest days, adding to the reserve even as she consumed it, keeping the supply at or above the original 3 cords. She cleared the entrance area after each storm. She walked the ridge periodically, not for pleasure exactly, but for the maintenance of her own capabilities. A 64-year-old body is a machine that requires regular use to remain functional, and Cordelia was not prepared to allow hers to stiffen into immobility inside a warm cave. She was surviving. More than surviving. She was maintaining. George Patton came in January. He came on a clear morning after a week of storms on snowshoes he had borrowed from the Hendricks family, who used them for hunting. He was breathing hard when he reached the ridge, 55 years old and not accustomed to altitude work, and he stood outside the cave entrance for a moment, catching his breath before he knocked on the door. Cordelia heard the knock and felt something unexpected move through her. Not surprised, she had thought someone from the settlement might come eventually. Something warmer than that, the recognition that someone had thought to check. She opened the door. George Patton stood in the snow, red-faced from the cold and the climb, holding his hat, the way men hold their hats when they are entering someone's home and want to show respect. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You look well," he said. The surprise in his voice was genuine and complete. "I am well," she said. "Come inside." He stepped through the doorway and stopped. She watched him take it in the living space, the stove radiating steady heat, the organized storage shelves along the natural ledges of the western wall, the neat sleeping platform in the corner, the lantern hung at precisely the right height for reading, the notebook on the sleeping platform, the coffee pot on the stovetop. He walked to the interior divider wall and looked over it at the firewood stacked in the storage section. He stood there for a long time without speaking. "You stacked it inside," he said finally. "From the beginning," Cordelia said. "Every piece went in before the first snow. It's all dry. Every piece." George turned and looked at the stove, then at the ceiling crack where the stovepipe disappeared into the mountain, then at the walls. "It's warmer in here than in my store," he said. "The granite holds heat. Once the stone warms through from consistent firing, it releases slowly for hours after the fire is banked. The surrounding mountain prevents rapid temperature change in either direction. I need to raise the interior temperature, perhaps 15 degrees above the stone's base temperature, to be comfortable. A surface dwelling would require raising it 50 or 60 degrees above whatever the outside air is doing. George was quiet for a moment. How much wood are you burning? Approximately 4 to 5 pounds per day during cold periods, perhaps 3 on milder days. I estimate I am using half a cord per month at current rates. You have 3 cords. A little more. He he did the arithmetic in his head and looked at her. Your supply will last until April. Comfortably. Past April, she said. George sat down on the bench she had built from split timber and looked at the fire through the stove grate. He had the look of a man who is revising something, a belief, an assumption, a picture of the world that had seemed complete and has just been shown to be missing something important. Cora, he said, then he stopped. She waited. There is a problem in the settlement, he said. 2 families, the Pruitt family and the Whitfield family. They are running short on wood, he paused. They have been burning wet stock since November. The tarps came off the Pruitt pile in the second storm, and Dale did not get them back on before the snow soaked in. The Whitfields had water intrusion from the roof, and it got into the woodshed. Another pause. The Pruitt boy, the youngest one, got his hands frostbitten last week. He is all right, but it was close. Cordelia looked at the fire, a child's hands. Frostbitten in a settlement, the woodpile 20 feet from the front door, because no one had understood that storing firewood outdoors in a Colorado winter was not storage. It was a slow disaster, waiting for the right storm. Send them up, she said. Cora, send them up, George. Both families. I will show them what I built and explain why it works. If Dale Pruitt can dig into the hillside behind his house and create an enclosed storage space before the next storm, he can replicate the principle. It does not require a cave. It requires protection from weather and stable temperature. George looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Dale Pruitt came 3 days later with his wife Marion, a capable-looking woman of 38, who had the hands of someone who worked hard and the eyes of someone who paid attention. Cordelia showed them everything. She showed them the storage section, first the wood stacked in organized rows, pale and dry, every piece accessible. She explained the principle in plain language, the same way she had explained everything in the notebook, without ornamentation, without condescension, with the directness of someone who has learned something through physical effort and wants to transmit it accurately. The wood must be protected from precipitation, she said, not just from above, but from the sides. Snow blows sideways in a ridge storm. It finds gaps in tarps. It finds the spaces between wallboards. Complete enclosure is the only reliable protection. Like a root cellar, Marion said. Exactly like a root cellar. Same principle. You are not creating warmth. You are creating stability. Underground or inside rock, the temperature stays near 40 degrees regardless of what the air is doing outside. Wood at 40 degrees will not absorb moisture the way wood at surface temperature does during a freeze-thaw cycle. Dale examined the storage section with the systematic attention of a man who builds things and knows how to read construction. He ran his hand along the interior wall divider, tested its stability, looked at the stovepipe installation, traced the natural ventilation path with his eyes. You thought about all of this before you built it, he said. It was not quite a question. I thought about it for 3 days before I started, Cordelia said. Then I built it and found out what I had missed and corrected as I went. What did you miss? She showed him the drainage channel near the entrance that she had added after the first storm, when she had noticed a thin line of snowmelt tracking across the floor. She showed him the canvas weather stripping at the door base that she had improved twice before she was satisfied with it. She showed him the ash banking technique that she had refined through trial and error to keep coals alive through the longest nights. Marion was writing in a small notebook she had brought. Cordelia noticed and felt something she had not expected, a sensation not unlike what she had felt when she had first pressed her palm against Harlan's initials in the cave wall. The recognition that something was being preserved. Passed forward. Write down the ash ratio, Cordelia said. For banking overnight, 1 part live coal to 2 parts white ash by volume packed firmly across the firebox floor. Leaves the coals insulated but not smothered. Marion wrote it down. The coldest night of the winter came on January 19th. Cordelia noted it in her journal, 32 below zero outside by my estimation. Inside before stoking 47 degrees. After 1 hour of moderate fire, 58 degrees. Wood consumed approximately 6 pounds the most in a single session. Interior held 53 degrees through the night with overnight banking, 32 below zero. The temperature at which exposed flesh begins to freeze in minutes, at which mechanical systems fail, at which the margin between prepared and unprepared becomes the margin between life and death. Inside the mountain, 58 degrees. She thought about the settlement below where families were burning through compromised wood supplies twice as fast as normal to compensate for the wet wood's poor combustion. Where the morning's first task was digging frozen wood out of snow-covered piles and trying to get it to light with kindling that was itself often damp. Where children were being kept close to stoves that were working too hard on fuel that was working too little. She thought about Dale Pruitt's youngest boy and his frostbitten hands. She built the fire up higher than usual that night and let the cave warm fully before she banked it for sleeping. Not because she needed it, because it felt right in some way she did not fully examine to be warm on the coldest night, to use the thing she had built for exactly the purpose she had built it for without apology and without restraint. She slept well. February came and then March, and the winter began its slow surrender. Not gracefully, Colorado winters do not surrender gracefully. There were storms in March that would have qualified as major events in any month days of bitter cold that arrived without warning, and reminded everyone at high altitude that the season was not finished simply because the calendar suggested it should be. But the light was changing. The sun's arc across the southern sky was climbing incrementally higher each day, and the direct light that entered the cave entrance in the mornings began to reach deeper into the interior, warming the floor stones further back than it had in December. Cordelia noted it in her journal. February 28th, morning light reaches the eastern wall for the first time, 2 feet further than January. She had consumed by her careful accounting 2 cords and 3/4 of firewood since November 12th. She had just over a quarter cord remaining stacked neatly in the storage section. More than enough for whatever remained of winter. She had burned dry wood every day. Not a single piece had hissed or smoked or failed to light. Not a single fire had required more than a few minutes to establish from banked coals. The system had functioned exactly as she had designed it to function, without failure, without compromise, from the first fire in November to the last cold morning of March. Dale Pruitt had built his earth-sheltered firewood storage in late February, digging into the hillside behind his house and constructing a simple enclosed chamber with a wooden door. He had moved what remained of his wood supply into it and reported to George that the remaining stock, though reduced, was drying rapidly in the stable temperature of the earth and space and was already burning better than it had in weeks. The Whitfield family had done the same with their woodshed, adding insulation to the walls and roof and sealing the door properly. George had told Cordelia both of these things on his second visit in February, and she had listened and said nothing beyond what was practical, which was, tell them to start their supply for next winter early. Cut in spring and store immediately. Do not wait until October. April came on a Tuesday. Cordelia woke that morning to the sound of water snowmelt running somewhere on the slope above a sound she had not heard in 5 months. She lay still for a moment listening. The cave was 48 degrees before she lit the stove. The light at the entrance had the particular quality of spring light at altitude, harder and brighter than winter light, carrying actual warmth rather than the cold brightness of January sun. She got up. She made coffee. She packed the things she was taking with her, not much. The notebook nearly full now, with 4 months of careful observation. Harlan's journal, the 7 books, her tools, the lantern. She would need to make several trips down to the settlement with the handcart. But first, she took Harlan's chisel from the tool roll and went to the eastern wall of the cave and stood before the 2 sets of initials, H.W. 1879. The space beside it where her own initials waited unfinished, C.W. She cut the year into the granite. 4 numerals carefully spaced the cuts clean and deliberate, 1883. She stepped back and looked at both, H.W. 1879, C.W. 1883, 4 years apart. A man who had found a place in the mountain and believed it was worth marking. A woman who had come back to finish what he started alone at 64 in the worst winter in recent memory. She pressed her palm flat against the granite beside both sets of initials the way she had pressed it on that October afternoon when she first found this place. The rock was warmer now than it had been then. The stored warmth of 4 months of fires had penetrated the stone, And though it would release that warmth over the coming weeks as the fire ceased right now, the granite held it. The accumulated warmth of every fire she had built since November. Every evening when had sat by the stove with Harlan's books every morning, she had rebuilt the flame from banked coals. The mountain had kept all of it. She took her hand from the wall and picked up her first load. George Patton was waiting outside the general store when she came down the trail with the handcart, just as he had been waiting with supplies in October. He looked at her the way people look at someone they were not certain they would see again and are genuinely glad to be wrong about. Well, he said. Well, she said. How much wood did you use? Just under 3 cords. I have a quarter cord remaining in the storage section. He shook his head slowly. Not in disbelief he had seen the system. He understood the math, but in the way that a person shakes their head when reality confirms something they understood intellectually, but had not fully felt until the evidence stood in front of them. Come inside, he said. I have coffee and I have a proposition. The proposition was straightforward. His store needed someone to manage the inventory and the accounts, the paperwork side of the business that George had always handled himself, but had begun to find overwhelming as the settlement grew. $25 a month, a room above the store, modest but private and warm. The work was not glamorous, but it was honest, and it was stable, and it was hers. Cordelia accepted. She did not hesitate, and she did not perform the ritual of pretending to consider an offer she had already decided to take. She had learned from 4 months alone in a cave that pretense was a luxury and directness was a form of respect. I will keep the cave, she said. Of course, George said, as if this had never been in question. I will need Saturdays to walk up and check on it, for the first few months at least. Saturdays are yours. She put out her hand and they shook on it. On her first Saturday, she walked back up to the ridge with an empty handcart and retrieved the remaining quarter cord of firewood. She would store it in the cellar below the general store where it would stay dry and be available. She stood in the empty cave for a long time before she left. The storage section was empty now, the organized rows of wood reduced to pale dust and a few small chips on the stone floor. The living section still held the sleeping platform, the interior divider wall, the stove with its pipe disappearing into the mountain. The natural shelves along the western wall still held a few small items. She had not yet carried down a spare candle, the tin of camphor salve, a length of rope. The cave looked inhabited. It looked like a place that had been lived in and would be again. She did not dismantle anything. In June of 1884, Dale Pruitt brought 3 other families from the settlement to see the cave and the storage system, and Cordelia spent an afternoon explaining everything she had recorded in the notebook. She answered questions with the patience of a woman who has thought carefully about something and wants others to understand it correctly, not approximately. By fall of 1884, 7 families in the settlement had built earth-sheltered or fully enclosed firewood storage. The principle spread, not because anyone organized a campaign, but because the results were visible and the logic was simple. Dry wood burns better than wet wood, and protecting wood from weather costs almost nothing compared to the cost of burning twice as much of it. Dale Pruitt, who had become an informal advocate for the technique, described it to a visiting engineer named Everett Holt in October of 1885. Everett Holt was 52 years old, a mining engineer from Pennsylvania, who had spent 30 years thinking about how people survived in high-altitude environments and had arrived at Silver Ridge on a consulting assignment that had been extended 3 times because he found the community more interesting than most. He was a widower, precise in his thinking and unassuming in his manner, with the hands of someone who did not consider himself above physical work. Dale brought him to the cave on a clear October afternoon. Everett Holt walked through the entire structure, slowly examining everything: the entrance wall, the lintel, the mortar technique, the ventilation system, the storage section, the stove installation. He read the inscriptions on the eastern wall. He stood for a long time looking at HW 1879, CW 1883, without speaking. Then he read Cordelia's notebook, which she had left in the cave precisely because she believed it should be available to anyone who wanted to understand what she had done and why. He came to the store the following morning. He introduced himself and shook her hand and said, I have read your construction notes. They are among the most precise field observations of passive thermal design I have encountered. You should know that what you built on that ridge demonstrates principles that engineers have been trying to articulate formally for 20 years. You articulated them with a hammer and a chisel in 11 days. Cordelia looked at him for a moment. I articulated them because I had no other choice, she said. That is usually when the best engineering happens, he said. They were married in March of 1886. The house they built together that spring incorporated everything Cordelia had learned from the cave. Stone walls for thermal mass, not granite excavated from a mountainside, but properly quarried and fitted stone, built with the same dry stone technique she had used on the cave entrance, mortared for permanence. The house was positioned on a south-facing slope to maximize winter solar gain. The main rooms oriented toward the sun, the storage and utility spaces on the north. The firewood was stored in a fully enclosed earth-sheltered structure adjacent to the house, accessible through an interior passage, so that wood could be retrieved without going outside in the worst weather. The house used perhaps one-third the firewood of comparable structures in the settlement. Everett built it. Cordelia designed the thermal systems. They argued about details the way engineers argue with evidence and diagrams in occasional frustration, and agreed on everything that mattered. In 1892, a professor from the Colorado School of Mines arrived in Silver Ridge, following correspondence with Everett, who had written a paper on passive heating in mountain environments that had cited the cave and Cordelia's construction notes extensively. The professor, a careful man named Aldous Brennan, spent 3 days studying the cave and interviewing Cordelia, and then wrote what became a widely referenced monograph on the application of natural thermal mass in high-altitude shelter design. He asked Cordelia what she would want people to understand about what she had done. She thought for a moment. That it was not remarkable, she said. That is the part people always get wrong. They want it to be remarkable because I was old and a woman and alone. But the cave was there. The granite was there. The principles were there. I simply paid attention to what was available and used it without complicating it. Brennan wrote that down. In the summer of 1920, a geological survey team working the ridge above Garnet Creek found the cave. The entrance was partially obscured by decades of accumulated brush and deadfall, but the wall was unmistakable, 6 feet of carefully laid dry stone across a granite opening, the mortar joints still holding after 37 years of freeze and thaw and the weight of accumulated seasons. The survey team leader, a geologist named Robert Aldrich, had the team clear the entrance and went inside. The stovepipe was still in place, the iron rusted but structurally present. The sleeping platform still held its stone structure, the pine needle mattress long since composted into the cave floor. The interior divider wall stood intact. The natural shelves along the western wall were empty but undamaged. Aldrich went to the eastern wall. He crouched down to read the initials cut into the granite. HW 1879, CW 1883. He held his lantern close and looked at the 2 sets of characters for a long time. Then he stood and looked around the chamber at the wall visible through the entrance, at the stovepipe running up into the mountain, at the level floor, in the divider wall, in the natural ventilation crack in the ceiling. He took out a survey journal and wrote, "Found remarkable stone construction inside natural granite cave. Dry stone wall of expert workmanship closing entrance. Interior partitions creating living and storage areas. Wood stove installation using natural rock chimney. Entire structure shows sophisticated understanding of thermal mass weather protection and practical engineering. Built 1883. According to local residents, Cordelia Whitmore, later Holt, age 64, alone. He wrote that last word and then read it back. Then he read the 2 sets of initials again. He closed his survey journal. He looked at his team who were standing quietly in the cave looking at the same things he had been looking at. No one said anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. Cordelia Whitmore Holt died on a September morning in 1921 at the age of 102 in the house she and Everett had built on the south-facing slope surrounded by the stone walls she had helped design with the firewood cellar full and dry outside the window. Everett had died in 1914, and she had spent 7 years without him in the house they had built together, managing the thermal systems and the firewood supply with the same methodical competence she had brought to everything for 64 years. Her obituary ran in the Silver Ridge Courier on the 14th of September. It mentioned her work at George Patton's store, her marriage to Everett Holt, and her contribution to passive building practices throughout the region. The editor, who had heard the story from people who had heard it from people who had been there, gave the cave its due in the final paragraph. He quoted Everett's words, which had appeared in the margin of one of his engineering papers. She needed shelter and dry firewood. She found a cave that provided natural protection and built a stone wall to improve it. Her firewood stayed dry because she stored it in the same protected space where she lived. Everything else was just details. The cave itself stood until the spring of 1947, when a rock slide on the ridge above finally covered the entrance and rendered the site inaccessible. 64 years after Cordelia had built the entrance wall by hand, alone with a damaged wrist, in 11 days before winter closed the mountain. The wall, as far as anyone could determine from the survey records, was still intact when the slide came down. The mountain simply decided after 64 years that it was ready to take the cave back. By then it did not matter. The firewood storage technique Cordelia had demonstrated had spread across the Colorado high country and become standard practice. Earth-sheltered storage in closed cellars, the principle of keeping fuel dry through complete weather protection rather than through hopeful tarps. These were ordinary knowledge. Now the kind of thing experienced homesteaders passed to new ones without attribution, because the attribution had dissolved into the general understanding of how to survive. Somewhere in that general understanding was a 64-year-old woman with a damaged wrist and 3 cords of dry wood and a mountain at her back. Somewhere in the granite of a ridge above Garnet Creek, under the rock slide in the dark, 2 sets of initials stood in the stone the way they had always stood. HW 1879, CW 1883, side by side, still there.